I'm not sure that I agree with, like,
Yeah.
that's the essence of the video. My understanding was different about...
Well, your understanding is wrong, but that's okay. Please tell us your wrong view.
Let me correct your understanding,
Yes,
which is wrong. No.
Humans are not isolated. Humans are imbued in the culture, in the tribe, in our context, even in our personal experiences. I would argue, for instance, there is no such thing as a purely personal experience. All right, we're back with part 2. This one for me, as you said and hinted at last time, really gets into the meat and potatoes now. Now we're not messing around. I wanted to start with a bit of an overview of what I thought was the thread of the lecture. So the thread that I picked up is that there's these shamans after the Upper Paleolithic transition that arise out of a need for increased trade, increased ability to interact with strangers, and understand an environment at a time when humanity was down to as few as perhaps 10,000 members. That's when we start getting the evolution of these guys who are trying to understand other people more, increase cognitive insight capacity. And the methods of shamanism become actually quite important. And so he details what those are, and we can go into deep detail, but just an overview here is, number one, they start by disrupting normal processes. You break your normal patterns. You start enacting an animal. You undergo sleep deprivation or psychedelics or starvation or social isolation. But something to break out of your normal pattern. Then what those patterns do, what you're trying to do, is to enhance entry into a flow state. And we're going to get into detail about what all that is, what things enhance it. But in that flow state, what you develop is an increased capacity for insight, the ability for implicit learning to emerge, to learn things at a level where you can't even necessarily speak what you have learned, but you gain knowledge. Intuition is another way of saying that. Some of those intuitions are connections between things that otherwise seemed unrelated. So you are in your brain, you're connecting different areas of your brain, you're connecting ideas that seemed unrelated in metaphorical ways, and that is what he calls the capacity for metaphor. And that allows these or allows transmission of these insights then that were previously unspoken, right? Is by making those disparate connections. And then from there, I would argue, and I think he's aiming at this, is that then there is the evolution of these psychotechnologies. And he doesn't explicitly say this, but the thought that came to me is that the psychotechnology itself is a standardized and learnable output of this ritualistic practice of gaining insight and metaphor. And then how does that spread? It spreads through the development of a learnable psychotechnology, a spreadable psychotechnology. So that not everyone has to be a shaman. You just need one shaman who can then aid in the development of... And those are cultural forces, so I'm bridging a bit liberally. But that was a particular idea that popped up for me that has, I think, a number of potential implications even today. So I don't know if you want to go specifically... There's one specific example that I'd like to maybe mention, and we can carry that through with us. I'm making a metaphor here. Is when I read the book Better by Atul Gawande, who's a physician who writes on medicine, it was a notes on medical performance, right? And he has a whole section on C-sections. And the C-section rate nationwide now is about 33%. Which is quite high, and many people have argued that it is unnecessarily high. That we could, and we know that standard vaginal delivery, when possible, has better outcomes, for mom at least, right? There is a technology, forceps delivery, that in studies has equivalent outcomes for baby and better outcomes for mom, because it's not a C-section, right? And so it's an interesting thing is that why is C-section so prevalent when forceps delivery really is not and is actually declining despite having, between mom and baby, better outcomes, right? And he makes the argument that forceps as a delivery method, the studies were done in experts, people who were really good at this. And forceps delivery is less teachable. It requires a bit of touch. It requires a bit of artistry in the hand of the physician, and it's not reliably transmissible to any resident. Whereas C-section, everything's exposed surgically, resident stands on one side, physician stands on the other, and the teaching proceeds linearly step by step. You can teach anyone, any physician at least, to do a C-section, right? And thus, it is a more reliable method of minimizing disastrous complications. So, yes, mom has a longer recovery time, but it's better than not having any option. And in some cases, it's better than having forceps in the hands of someone who doesn't have that magic touch, whatever that is, right? So, the analogy I'm making here is one of the advantages of a psychotechnology over a shaman, for instance, is that the shaman requires a bit of artistry. It requires some insight, some ability to develop implicit learning. Whereas the psychotechnology, once it's been developed, is spreadable like the alphabet, right? And the ease of learning is actually a tremendously important factor of a psychotechnology in its cultural impact anyway. So that's the thread I want to throw in there. And then the idea that rituals are also psychotechnologies, right? They're standardized. And I loved his definition, by the way, of psychotechnology, is that a psychotechnology is a standardized method of enhancing cognition. And that standardized method idea is kind of what got me thinking about this, is that the whole idea is to remove a little bit of that artistry, that je ne sais quoi, right? And so we're seeing that now, even in modern times, with Midjourney and with ChatGPT and these, is that the artistry of graphic design or copywriting is now being standardized in some ways and becoming more accessible. It's the ability to represent your intuitions artistically, to represent your ideas in well-formed stories or words, is being democratized by some of these technologies. So anyway, that's the overview.
I'm not sure that I agree with, like, that's the essence of the video. My understanding was different about...
Well, your understanding is wrong, but that's okay. Please tell us your wrong view.
Let me correct your understanding,
Yes,
which is wrong. No, but my take was different. So I did not connect the shamanistic flow state to psychotechnologies. I did not think that was the point that he was making, is that, well, the shaman gets into a flow state and out of that experience then emerges some kind of psychotechnology that is then scalable, right? Like I don't know that what he was getting at is that shamanism and the ritual of, whatever ritual that you engage in, that activity then somehow at some point in time is distilled into a psychotechnology, e.g., for example, writing.
He did not make that claim. No.
No, but
that was my job.
I think that he's talking about two different things. So there's the shamanism, in which he then says that, well, that set of rituals enhanced the practitioner's ability to enter into a flow state, and then talks about why that is such a profound state, and we can get into that in a little bit. And then full stop, and then he says that at the end of the Bronze Age, 1200 BC, society collapsed, and that resulted in the forced evolution of new ways of thinking, one of which was alphabetic literacy and numeracy. And that occurred, 1200
Well, it's not.
BC.
I've added a jump for sure, but it's not quite full stop. He does say that part of what the shaman gains is the ability to induce states in others. The placebo effect, for instance, he mentions, right? Sure. So it's not quite full stop, meaning that it's not, the insight is not merely limited to the shaman. Part of the insight is a partial spreadingness of the insight he has gained.
But I don't know that that's connected to, like, alphabetic literacy or numeracy. That's not how
Well,
I understood it at
he
all.
doesn't make the leap, but I guess I would argue that somebody had to come up with the idea, or some set of somebodies had to evolve that concept. And the insights along the way were, not that they were necessarily done in some sort of like ritualistic, shamanistic way, but the core process of developing insight is what he's talking about.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure that I agree with that take at all, which is great. It's always good when we don't agree with each other.
No, I mean, but how else would you? I mean, if you have a hieroglyphic, ideographic written language, right? At some point, somebody has the insight is that, hey, why don't we just represent the sounds we're making? Why don't we develop something phonetic, right? That's a leap. That's exactly the kind of metaphorical leap that I think he talks about with shamanism, and that is the direct precursor to an alphabetic language.
I have sort of viewed the invention of alphabetic literacy that he talks about and then the attendant benefits that brings it in terms of enhancing metacognition as a completely separate conversation from the induction of a flow state, which once you get into a flow state, you end up being able to create connections between supposedly disparate things and are able to appreciate the quote unquote truth of a matter, right? And so that is a way of cognating. And, maybe some part of that then eventually leads to inventions like alphabetic literacy. But I think if it does even, that is a much smaller part of the larger point that he's making. So yes, if shamanism results in enhanced creativity and that in itself results in inventions like alphabetic literacy, that's all well and good. But that is a smaller point, I think, that he's making. I think the larger point is that there is such a thing as a flow state, and why is it that this state is such a profound experience that humans have, and what is it?
So again, I think you're undercutting the value of the connection, and I agree the importance of the flow state, and we're going to get into that. But if you, for instance, even when he talks about the axial revolution and the collapse of the Bronze Age, right, around 1100 BCE, the idea that why would that stimulate more invention, right? He makes vague comments, but I think you can push that a little further, is that one of the things that is important for getting into a flow state and developing implicit learning is that failure matters. Mm-hmm. So if you're a part of one of these dinosaur Egyptian millennia-long cultures, well, how much does failure matter? It matters a lot less because there's so much stability. In the context where you're in a city where things are barely hanging on, the insights of shamans dramatically rise in importance because you need those insights for survival at a higher level. So failure matters more, and that in itself precipitates flow state and in itself precipitates further invention. I think that would be the mechanism I would propose. Because he doesn't propose a mechanism. He just says, well, under these constraints, then there was more experimentation, right? But I think he's already provided the explanation as to why that would be.
You're taking that idea of failure mattering in flow states a little bit too broadly and thinking, he also talks about the tight loop feedback when you have in flow states. That rock climbing is a great example, right? So if you fail there, you're just going to drop to your death or get grievously injured. So he's talking about like failure matters in the immediate, in the time that you're in the flow state. You make a wrong step or you do something wrong, then there's a catastrophic immediate feedback loop that occurs. I don't think he's talking about failure occurring in a sort of meta-civilizational way, because that's not related to flow states.
Because he talks about understanding even how deer think, right? Getting into the mind of the deer, right? If you don't get into the mind of the deer and you're unsuccessful and you fail, well, it's not an immediate catastrophic failure. It's you will fail to catch the deer. Your hunting will be less successful, right?
No, it doesn't. But that's fairly. It doesn't have to be catastrophic, right? I mean,
but it's not even immediate. It's not immediate. You're not hunting at the moment, right? It's an overall reduction in an understanding of where the deer are.
But it's more immediate than the sort of meta-civilizational failure that they're describing, like this entire Bronze Age collapsed over decades and maybe a century or so. That is definitely not an immediate failure, right? That is a
well. I think this goes back to what we were talking about. Is that if you have, and he mentions, is that if your tribe has a shaman, you will outcompete other tribes because you will have a greater flow of insights, right? Among which may be various psychotechnologies, right? Your capacity for experimentation and invention is a direct survival advantage for your little barely hanging on city after the collapse of civilization. Yeah, whoever has the best ideas is going to win to a pretty significant degree.
Shamanism existed for thousands of centuries before that collapse occurred.
Correct.
Right? So what was the point of it then? I mean, so it almost seems like you're suggesting that shamanism gained ascendancy around that time. And it was, let me ask you this question another way. What is the relevance of shamanism during, say, the Egyptian era or that era in general? During the Bronze Age, when nothing was collapsing at all, shamanism still existed, right? And if it did,
still existed, but I would argue that the rituals of those insights were not as important for most people, right? The importance of the spreadability of new ideas and new experiments.
But then you're discounting the importance of the practice for thousands of years, that it only is relevant.
No, because obviously even during the Egyptian times, they did invent technologies, right?
It's kind of strange how you are much more empirical in your understanding of this than I am, right? You're saying, well, this experience results in increased cognition, which results in inventions that are then used in the actual world, psychotechnologies or whatever, that are used in the... Whereas I interpreted the whole flow state as a very personal inner experience that may or may not result in inventions that are made, but that's like secondary to the importance
of course, may or may not... Okay, let me put it this way, is... If you take all the shamanistic rituals and insights that are gained or whatever is gained, some tiny fraction of that may result in an invention or a spreadable technology.
Sure.
Of all the inventions and psychotechnologies and spreadable technologies, I would argue 100% of them came from some sort of insight.
Fair enough.
A moment precipitated by a flow state,
sure.
right?
Sure.
So that's all I'm saying, is those technologies arose out of the earlier...
Agreed.
It's a small fraction of the total
right,
insights.
Sure. Let us say it's even 5%, which is probably overstating the case.
Is a drive,
Sure, 100% agree. It's a small fraction. What then is the significance of the practice the other 95% of the time, in your mind? What is the point of it? Is it just pointless if it doesn't result in inventions, or is there significance to the experience?
I think I'm questioning your definition of significance. It may have been significant to that person. They may have experienced it as meaningful in themselves.
Well, yeah, and given that this series is called Awakening from the Meaning Crisis, the idea that it induces a state of meaning and purpose is highly relevant here, right?
Sure, but as we discussed last time, human beings are very social creatures. So the idea that something can be meaningful truly in isolation, I think, is mistaken. I think that we are social down to the core. And so the moment you know this perfectly well, the moment you have a deep insight, what is the first thing you do? Is you call me and you don't want to tell me about it, right? because that's
call
what we
other
do.
People too.
Okay, and other people. That's making my point stronger, actually, right? Is that nobody just has a great insight and then's like, and fuck the rest of the world, right? Like, you want to share it with, that's deeply woven into the nature of meaningfulness, is the desire to share.
Yeah, but it starts off with the spark of that sense of meaning, though. I don't know that it's... Yeah, so it's. I'm surprised that you went in this direction, but then again, that's the reason I wanted to have these conversations with you, right? That you're seeing things that I'm not seeing, and then we're sort of like try to find a point in the middle. Yeah, I think you're overstating the importance of connecting the flow state experience with the invention of psychotechnologies. I mean, I think those conversations were juxtaposed in the same lecture, but I don't know that one necessarily leads to the other. As you've acknowledged, I don't necessarily think he connects the dots. He's like, therefore, then literacy was,
he does not,
defined.
But we're not.
There
are other insights. There are other insights other than John Vervaeke's. Like, the world is not only John Vervaeke's set of insights.
You're putting this narrative in his head or in his lecture. It's like, well, he's saying this, and I don't think that's what he's saying.
Sorry, I'm not. I explicitly said even at the beginning that I was making the leap.
Yeah,
and
I think
juxtaposed these, but I think that there's a reason that those are juxtaposed. I don't think that it's arbitrary that he made that leap, right? Like, it may not have been in his head, but I think that there's a reason these ideas go together sequentially, right?
Yeah, I think it's fair to say.
He didn't arbitrarily stop one and then start a brand new thread, irrespective of anything he had said before. right? I think that the whole idea of enhancing insight and using things to further enhance your insight, well, where do those things come from? From the insights. He talks about that loop, right? He talks about the feedback loop of flow state is that flow state enhances your ability to gain insight, but then those insights break previous patterns. Mm-hmm. And then the broken pattern allows for further flow state. And so there's a looping there that feeds on itself. And I think all the psychotechnologies that emerge would emerge from that loop, done, repeated by different individuals over different times.
No doubt. I mean, even if you go for a walk, for example, as you mull over some idea, right? That's, in some sense,
I don't walk.
Trying to enter a flow state, right? Or whatever it is, whatever ritual you get through when you're trying to push through an idea and you're stuck on something, whether that's a walk or whatever it is, right? Sure. Meditation, you hit the sauna, you go swimming, you go running, whatever the activity is, you're entering flow state to just try to solve problems and perhaps gain insight. I think the point I'm making is that there's more profundity there in the flow state idea and how it relates to imbuing one with a sense of meaning, more profundity there than just, well, it leads to useful inventions. Which is how I think you're taking it, is that in order to get to a psychotechnology that's useful for the world, we get to flow states. We need flow states, and that perhaps is pretty much as relevant as flow states are for the purpose of conversation, is that they lead to psychotechnologies that then
I think you're putting words in my mouth there. I said that it was...
Well, you're putting words in his mouth.
I said I didn't put words in his mouth. I explicitly said they were my own words. But I think that there is a thread of connection that he did not explicitly make. It may have been in his head. I may be pure, but he didn't say it. I'm saying it, but I think there is a thread of connection between these two things. And the only reason I'm saying, I don't think that's the only word you've put in my mouth in that sense is only. I think there can be fantastic importance to the flow state, irrespective of its output.
What are those in your head?
Yes,
what are the other ones?
Sorry.
Besides inventing psychotechnologies, what are the other profound implications of the existence of flow states? Forget about psychotechnologies for a second. What's the point? I mean, are they useful?
You want my personal answer or
I mean, whatever.
Because I don't think he covers that.
Yeah, your answer. Yeah, we're talking about his
work.
So what is your take on...
Oh, so now you want my answer.
As long as you make it clear it's your opinion.
No, my current intuition, and I'm curious to see whether listening to him changes this, because I have a very unsatisfying answer to that, is that meaningfulness, as far as I understand it, is the end of the road. Meaning that the experience of meaningfulness is the prime mover in some of these, in many human endeavors, right? I experience this with patients as I try to explore their sources of meaning or whatever, and somebody might say, oh, like, I really want to lose weight, right? And it's like, okay, well, why? Just for self-improvement? And one might say, yeah, just for self-improvement. Okay, well, why do you want to improve yourself? And there's no answer. It's just, I find that meaningful. I find self-improvement meaningful, right? Another person might say, well, I want to improve myself to be a good role model for my children. Okay, well, his meaning is not in self-improvement. His experience of meaningfulness is in the family experience, right? So these are different people. They gain a sense of meaning from a different section of the same behaviors, right? But once you if I ask that other guy, the second guy, why do you want to set a good example for your family? Why do you want to be a part of a family? He won't have an answer. There's no, because I find it meaningful, period. Right?
Right. Yeah.
And a third guy you might do the same process with, and he might say, well, I want to be a part of a family because I feel like that really expresses who I am as a person. There's something about creating a family that is a genuine expression of my soul, almost in an artistic sense. My art is the creation of my... That's a third source of meaning. And if I say, well, why do you want to express your soul? He won't have an answer. But the true drivers of meaning are self-referential in some sense. It's the end of your psychological road.
Yeah.
So the point, if you ask what is the point of flow state, well, it's difficult to answer because it is its own point. That is the experience of meaningfulness.
Well, right, yeah. And I would say that's the larger part of the answer to that question, And that's the more important part of the answer to that question. I don't know why you said flow states lead to psychotechnologies when you could have acknowledged that's like perhaps a minority outcome. A minority of the times it will lead to a useful technology, for example. Which, by the way, is quite rare. It's very rare to come up with psychotechnologies. They happen very, very rarely, right? Meditation or literacy. I mean, there's a handful of these things that are very profound. So if we both acknowledge that these flow states lead to these kind of breakthroughs,
disagree with
a minority. Hold on, the flow states result in a breakthrough in a minority amount of the time. The fact that the activities that induce flow states have been around through multiple cultures for a very long amount of time, the fact that they have existed and they're an end unto themselves, that's the profound point, I think, to the first part of his lecture, is that we find the people who are in a flow state have a greater sense of meaning, and there's something to meditate about with that fact. Like, well, there's something there to talk about. As opposed to, flow states are useful because sometimes they lead to psychotechnologies, which it seems like that's the point you were making. Correct.
That's not the point I was making.
No?
No. So first of all, I disagree partly with your claim about how rare invention of psychotechnology is. And I'll say that from a personal level. As I'm counseling patients, for instance, they will invent their own personal psychotechnologies. They don't spread, right? But they say, well, actually, I realized that when I journal, I actually do better. When I meditate, I do better, right? In this particular way, when I meditate on this, or this type of meditation works better for me, right? Or I tell myself when I'm feeling nervous that whatever, and that helps me, right? That's their own little psychotechnology, is they develop their own mantra, their own ways of talking to themselves to say, when I'm in the gym and I'm super lazy, like I have no interest in actually exerting myself, but I want the outcome, right? Well, yeah, so I imagine that like I'm in a concentration camp and somebody's going to kill my parents if I don't do another rep, right? So that is a mini psychotechnology that allows me to do more reps than I would otherwise, right? So I think that people invent their own little psychotechnologies all the time, and I'm using his definition of a standardized method of cognitive enhancement, right? The cognitive enhancement of the example I gave is grit, is I increase my capacity for grit by using this standardized method of thought. Right, which was an insight I gained at some point when I was in CrossFit and dying, and I entered a flow state, right? So I don't know that is the point, but it is a frequent outcome that provides other benefits, right?
Okay,
so hang on. Here's a really interesting one: is I suspect that, and I haven't analyzed myself, but if you develop patterns of how to enter flow state, those patterns are psychotechnologies for you. Mm-hmm. And those psychotechnologies probably were derived in a flow state. Mm-hmm. And so you are enhancing your opportunity to experience meaningfulness while you're in a flow state experiencing meaningfulness, and it becomes self-referential again, right? So I would argue that the psychotechnologies have tremendous benefits even within your own definition of the experience of meaningfulness. Even if you posit that the experience of meaningfulness or flow state is the end of the road, even then, the capacity for entering flow state is in itself contingent upon certain psychotechnologies.
So if psychotechnologies the creation of psychotechnologies was not a potential outcome, let's just pretend for a second, of engaging yourself in a flow state, if that never happened, right? Beyond that, what is the significance of flow states in your head? Why even talk about them if let's pretend for a second psychotechnologies are not created in flow states? Is there any significance to the experience outside of their utility for the creation of psychotechnologies? Does it
As I said,
something about the human condition or the human mind that these experiences exist?
So I think you're trying to deconstruct something that I don't think is quite deconstructible in that way, right? And what I mean by that is you could say that there is no need for any particular output. at all. And merely the experience internally of that state is a goal in itself, right? I would argue that that attempt at carving it out misses a significant part of the point of who we are as humans. Humans are not isolated. Humans are imbued in the culture, in the tribe, in our context. And so the impact on context matters a tremendous amount, even in our personal experiences. There is no, I would argue, for instance, there is no such thing as a purely personal experience. We outsource significant parts of our sanity even. It's like, did I see that thing? Well, did you see it? Or did I hallucinate it? Right? You see something out of the corner of your eye, right? We ask each other, like, did you see that? We often check with others because we are, I think it underestimates the degree to which we are social. To think that you could have an internal sense of meaningfulness divorced from its connections with your context.
Well, so how then would you explain stories of profound insight, nirvana, like the Buddhists say? That doesn't happen in a crowded room. A lot of the times people who, are meditate, they are reclusive. They go somewhere where they're alone, and they're alone for a long time, solitary confinement or solitary sort of meditation.
I would argue modern Buddhists do. I think that's actually an interesting dilemma, right? Because what did Buddha do when he had his insight? He tried to spread it, right?
Yeah, but
so oddly enough,
but
the idea of trying to experience nirvana for yourself is, I think, number one, probably gets in the way of it. But number two, I mean, even the Buddhists have a saying, right? Is before enlightenment, cut wood, carry water. After enlightenment, cut wood, carry water.
Like that's be part of society or be
and your life doesn't change, right?
No, I mean, yes, you may share the insight after you have it, but there's no doubt that it can occur, and it's more likely to occur in isolation at times, or even the fact that it can occur completely in isolation, not connected to anybody else. That the insight comes from a place that's completely disconnected from other humans in the area. Which is an often described,
but that's an absurd idea on the face of it, because you carry your entire childhood context with you. You carry all the upbringing, all your experiences up until that moment when you leave. So, I mean, if you are, we talked about Helen Keller last time. If you're so isolated that, actually there was an Egyptian king that ran this experiment, kept a child completely isolated from society, given food and water, but and did not develop language. And we've seen that actually in modern times. There was a pretty awful case of a young girl who was kept locked in a closet by her parents and never developed language, right? So this girl is not going to go off and have the same sorts of insights alone because she's not participating in the human context.
Yeah, so I'm not sure, so what I'm trying to get to here is that the flow state, the sense of meaning, purpose, the connectedness that people get from flow states, all of that is available to you. Yes, of course, you're part of the human race and you're connected to the earth and, you're all star stuff. I mean, of course, you're connected in some ways, but the experience can, in the moment, be entirely solitary, right? And the fact that it can occur in a solitary manner, yes, you can maybe share it with others after you're done, but the fact that it's available to you without other people having to be around you means that there's...
But people are, again, I think you're distinguishing the physical existence of people around you, right? Versus even your ability to think in language, right? All of those things are people around you, even in isolation, because you carry your human connected context with you, no matter how isolated you are. I'm trying to say, if you were a truly isolated human, like one of these unfortunate children, you would not have those experiences, right?
Yeah.
You don't.
It almost, I mean, again, correct me if I'm wrong. Are you saying then that the utility of these sort of flow states, what is the point of them? I mean, I guess it's almost like you are trying to turn it into a outcome-based, validated based on the outcome that it leads to, as opposed to it being significant.
I think that's your projection. What I'm trying to make, I think, is a bit more subtle than that. Is I don't think you can separate two things that you're trying to separate. I think you're trying to separate the experience and meaningfulness from its social context, and I don't think those things are separable. I think those two things are so deeply woven that it is a single thing.
That's where I would disagree, and it kind of like opens up what I got out of it. So let me tell you what I sort of got out of the beginning of it, right? So my take when he was talking about the flow state, and let me just refer to some of my notes over here, is people who are in them have an enhanced sense of meaning in the world, right? I mean, they just feel more connected. They feel like they have more meaning. That's one of the things he actually talked about. People who can get into flow states report that they have a greater sense of meaning and purpose in their lives, right? And in the moment when it's occurring, you tune out the chatter in your head, and you're just sort of focused on the thing, and you feel good afterwards, right? And we talked about this in the last episode as well, is that we don't really have a word for what it is to be like a person who's in a flow state, right? Is it a feeling? Is it an emotion? Is it a state? What is it? I mean, like we said, the Germans may have a word for it, but we just call it a sense of meaning, right? Is it a sense? Is it an emotion? Is it a feeling? Let's just call it a sense of meaning, and let's acknowledge that the English language does not have a proper word for that state of mind, right? But it gets you there, right? So flow state gets you there, and if you're engaged in an activity that sort of imbues you with this sense of meaning, one of the things that I got out of this conversation, or at least one of the doors it opened for me that I started thinking of, and I'm gonna quote Lex Friedman for just a second over here, where a lot of the times he asks his guests at the end of his podcast, like, what is the meaning of life, right? And implicit in that question is that the other guy is going to like come up with some answer that resembles a philosophical position, right? Or it could be, the answer could be, well, the meaning of life is to be happy, or to love everybody, or to love yourself, or accept, or, fill in the blank self-help, fortune cookie cutter bullshit, the pithy aphorism that is the answer to that question, as if the question has a philosophical answer that can be written down in an essay or a paragraph, or could be answered in a podcast, right? And that's always how I think empirically it's thought of, right? Like, why does an eclipse happen? What is the answer to that question? And the answer is a very discrete set of things that happen. What is the meaning of life? Well, the answer must be a very discrete kind of like breakdown of what that is. But one of the doors that this flow state conversation opened for me, and again, this is not what he's saying, this is my door opening and thinking through, is that perhaps that's the wrong question to ask. If a flow state can result in a person just having a sense of meaning in their lives, and they engage in an activity that results in flow states relatively frequently, then perhaps the question to ask is not what is the meaning of my life, but the question is what activity should I engage in so that my life is filled with a sense of this meaning. And that is perhaps the better question to ask, and that meaning to life is an action. It is a series of actions. It is not an abstraction that is communicated in words, but it is sort of an embodied action, a way of living a life that then imbues you in turn with a sense of meaning. So that's sort of the biggest thing I got out of it. I think the point, though, I think that he was making with the whole idea of flow states, I mean, separate from meaning, is that it was a signal-inducing mechanism, in that in all of the sort of like infinite amount of information that's hitting my senses, of all of the patterns that I see across time, which of those patterns are really pertinent? Which of these patterns are salient? Which of these patterns actually matter? And inducing your mind into altered states of consciousness, whether that be like the shamans did, they were trying to put themselves in an altered state of consciousness. So some of those patterns become a bit more evident. They make cross connections between ideas that did not seem connected, and that's when insight occurs. So one of my sort of empirical takes on it is that the flow state induction was a mechanism for signal finding amongst the random data.
Okay.
It's like how do you get disparate bits of data to connect in ways that are actually true, right? How do you get to the truth of the matter that these two things are connected to each other in a way that is quote unquote real, and it's not just a correlative association, but it is a
Mhm.
causative association.
Causative,
The connection
yeah,
is,
sure.
is an actual real connection. That was my interpret. So that was, I think, the reason he was getting into the whole idea of a flow state, is that this is a signal generating mechanism, truth from untruth. And for
So-
whatever reason, it also sort of imbues the individual with a sense of a meaning, purpose, because they just turn
So
into the
Here's an interesting abstraction that just occurred to me literally in this moment, so it may be complete bullshit. But what if the experience of meaningfulness is the formation of new connections? And I'm using that now in a very broad way. So, but we see that, right, is that insight is forming new connections, connecting disparate ideas, right? And we find that meaningful. Connecting, improving myself is connecting my future self to my present self. That's a connection, right? We find intimacy and family meaningful, right? There is a connective element to all of these things. And so perhaps the experience of meaningfulness is the formation or maintenance or experience of connection. And that's what all of these different types of meaningful experience, commonly meaningful experiences have in common, is that they are connective in some way. And that's why perhaps flow state is maybe not a prerequisite, but certainly an inducement to the experience of meaningfulness, is that it helps you form connections, right? True connections, as you pointed out, right? So it's not, and maybe there's something there too. We talk of intimacy even as like, oh, it's a true connection, right? That there's that sense, right? I don't know. It just literally occurred to me in this moment that may be the thread of connection between meaningful experiences. And the reason I'm harping on that a little bit is, he said that people who experience flow state more frequently report having more meaningful lives, right? He did not say, and this is an important perhaps commentary, that the experience of meaning happens in the flow state. And at least in my experience of flow state, that's exactly right. I don't perceive I perceive those moments as meaningful after the fact.
Right.
While I'm in flow state, I actually don't perceive it as meaningful because I'm too absorbed. There's no self-awareness, right? And so perhaps what is necessary
in those
for...
cases, the sense of meaning is the afterglow of the flow state is one way.
Correct. And I would argue the sharing of the output of the flow state, right? And so the flow state is a necessary precursor.
I'm not sure that the sharing part is integral to having the meaning.
I think it depends a little on your personality and personal orientation. I could conceive of someone who did not require that. Okay. I think it would be a rare person who was sufficiently divorced from that. I mean, as we've both pointed, the minute you have an insight, you want to call a friend, right? The minute you have any of those experiences of like, hey man, I had the best steak I've ever had in my life, right? You want to share that. You want to talk about that, right? While you're in it, you're in flow. You're just experiencing this nirvana of this steak, right? Like, I'm not trying to call somebody in the middle of the steak. But when the steak is over, I do want to tell somebody about this incredible meal I had at this place, right? And so, yeah, I think the sense of meaningfulness is a little bit what you pull out of the flow state, and I think sharing is a big part of that for most people. The vast majority of people don't want to have a brilliant insight in science and invent a new theory and keep it to themselves. Right? Maybe. I mean, we wouldn't know because obviously they didn't share it, so they died with it, right? But in general, no matter how introverted you are as a mathematician or scientist, when you have that brilliant insight, you do want to share how brilliant you are, right? Like,
yeah. I also just want to make sure that we don't overemphasize the flow state and the resultant sense of meaning that it provides as if it's the only way that happens, right? I think that he was using that as an example that, hey, listen, these people get into flow states that describe increased sense of meaning, but I think we both acknowledge that's not like the only way to get there, right? It almost sounds from this conversation like we're believing that it's the only way.
Well, maybe it is the only way. Actually, I'll play that out, at least devil's advocate.
Well, let me ask you then: when a person is with his family and just enjoying a lazy Sunday afternoon with his kids and his dog, he gets a profound sense of fulfillment. Where in that experience is the flow state that you're describing, or even the connections? No, it's not a flow state. He's.
What is your understanding of flow state then?
So I think the way he described it is that there's a specific set of criteria that results in the induction of the flow state. And one of the things he described is the activity you're engaged in is just a little bit beyond your capability to do. Mm-hmm. There's immediate feedback you get right away, whether or not the thing you're doing. I mean, the rock climbing analogy is a perfect one, right? So it's always a little bit difficult. If you you get feedback immediately. You're constantly fixated on solving a problem that's just a little bit outside your capacity to fix. If it's too easy for you, then you get bored. If it's too hard, then you get frustrated. But it's just a little bit beyond your capability. So even to the author whose name I can't pronounce, who introduced the idea, the flow state. So he was describing the flow state in that context, and he says, well, video game-induced flow states, rock climbing, jiu-jitsu, all of those things. So I'm not sure.
But why not? But why not bond? But why not bonding to your family?
But how is that how does that map onto the activities that I just described? An ability
because there is a skill in connection. There's a skill in bonding. There's a skill in participating. I mean, he talks about in the very first in the
no. I mean, in the moment when all the connections are just sort of stable and nothing needs to be upgraded, when you get along fine with your wife and kids, and everyone is just lazing around in the living room, and you just feel a sense of peace. You're not doing anything. You're in fact just relaxing. You're not actually even exerting yourself.
So your skill at relaxation, right?
I'm
which by the way, I feel acutely because I'm not good at it, right? So
I'm not sure that.
So to me, that strikes me as a skill. Right?
I'm not sure competitive relaxation is going to be able to get you to flow states. I'm not sure that's... I think you're trying to map on the flow state idea to, well, this is the model for all meaning making.
I think you're unnecessarily limiting your understanding of flow state. I think that we can talk about the examples like rock climbing and so on and so forth because they are easy to point at. I don't know that those are the only experiences of flow state. I mean, the times I've experienced flow, I think it does map pretty readily onto even the kind of relaxed experience that you're talking about. It's when you are in flow and what was difficult is easy, right? Is I think many people report like, oh, I can't let go of my life stress and really just be here on a Sunday afternoon with my family. And that's what I want, is I want to just enjoy this, to fully enjoy this context. And when they are successful at letting go of all that stress, ignoring the rest of the world, and being fully present, I think that is a form of flow.
Yeah, but
it's not an easy thing.
Does flow state require no effort then? If you're in a
flow state's tricky. Flow state's tricky because it requires effortless effort, right? Like there is that experience of effortlessness.
Of some kind, but effort of some kind. I do know what you mean. I mean that.
And so how many meditation principles are about being present? Certainly, we perceive being wholly present with yourself as a difficult thing, or there wouldn't be so much teaching about it.
Sure.
Right? So, yeah, I think...
But it seems like you're making my point for me, that effort is required.
Sure. Right? And so, but then in participating in that family milieu is being fully present. The thing that all the meditators
are... It's not necessarily effortful. It's not necessarily... I mean, if you're just completely
You
relaxed,
just said it was effortful.
No, and not that example. So I'm not giving you the idea that if lazing around on a Sunday afternoon with your kids and your dog and your family is some kind of an effortful experience. You could, I mean, just going on vacation.
I would call that a meditation. I would call that if you really experience what you're talking about, right? Where you are you're not self-aware of being in. You will become aware of it the next day. That, man, that was an amazing day. I just was present all day with my family, right? I would call that a meditation. I would call that an incredibly successful meditation for an entire day of being fully present. And it's something that people aim for, that people explicitly strive towards unsuccessfully for years, right? Is in trying to learn to meditate. And then some people get lucky and fall into that one Sunday afternoon because their context strikes them. And I would say that is exactly flow.
Yeah, I feel like you're expanding the definition of it. I mean, beyond the things that he talked about.
I feel like you're contracting it. So that's.
I mean, I'm going by the way he talked about flow in the video itself. Like, he even put up a graph of,
he gave like a few examples that are. I guess what I'm saying is those are not the only examples that exist. I don't know why you're I don't know why you're limiting your concept of effort to a subset of things, right? I think you've granted that achieving full presence is a difficult thing that requires some form of effort.
Yeah,
that's what meditators are trying towards.
By that definition, just being alive on the earth requires effort. Just being requires effort, and then you could, if you loosen definition
in what
what
way?
is effort.
In what way? Wait. No, in what way? In what way does just being on earth require effort?
Your heart has to beat. You have to remember to breathe, and blink your eyes.
No, but but who is striving to do that? Who is created
the soul or whatever inhabiting your. Yeah, I don't know that I agree with you.
I mean, I can point to entire disciplines of people learning to try to meditate, to be fully present and aware, mindfulness and all of it. There's entire disciplines of people who admit that this is difficult, and that's why they put effort into it.
So that hypothetical Sunday afternoon that we discussed, if it comes to you without any effort on your part, right? If it just happens that the universe forms around you just to give you the day, right? And you haven't worked for it at all, and that day it's a gift to you from the universe, and it gives you that sense of purpose, meaning, and it grounds you, right? Where did flow come into that then? You could have these positive experiences just out of sheer luck. It just happens. You just happen to be kissed by the universe for a second, right? And if that happens, and it imbues.
So, by the way, and I think in that regard, I think now you're creating very specific examples. So I'll have to also be a bit nitpicking, right?
In order to disprove the larger point, right?
Sure, but then I can also. He does point out that the examples he gives of trying to be on the edge of your skill level, for instance, right, are things that increase your probability of entering a flow state. Mm-hmm. Right?
Yeah.
So it's a non-zero probability even without that. Or I could claim that there's a non-zero probability.
I don't get
without
that last point. I'm not sure I got what you were getting at.
So if doing something effortful and difficult on the edge of your skill level with a tight feedback loop and something that matters,
yeah,
right? Those are factors that increase the probability of your entering a flow state. He doesn't say they're necessary requirements. He doesn't say that they're sufficient requirements. He says that they increase the probability of entering a flow state, right? So I would argue that it is possible, though uncommon, to enter a flow state without any of those, except perhaps that it matters. I think that might be the only one that's necessary.
Yeah, I mean, we're I guess just talking about different definitions of the word at this point, right? I've always understood flow state the way he describes it, right? And you're sort of saying, well, the word actually means more than what he talks about and how I've understood it.
No, I think I think you're. So okay, this hypothetical guy who has this Sunday afternoon, right? What is he experiencing? How would you name? Because I think he would experience all of those things, a sense of all the things that are described as being flow state, a sense of oneness, connectedness, right? A sense of meaningfulness afterward, a sense of connection to the universe. I think all of those things would be present that delineate what a flow state is. So I think you're getting hung up on his examples of things that typically promote a flow state versus the state itself. The state itself is that experience of complete absorption.
Yeah, I mean, it is that of complete absorption, but I think the guy lazing around in his, in on that Sunday afternoon, I mean, he could be on his phone and still have that feeling. He could be watching a movie and then be in trance. Then he goes out and barbecues and does any number of things that are completely disconnected. Just spends the day with his family, right? And imbued into his consciousness is just this sense of gratitude, fulfillment. But I don't know that he's necessarily lost in the moment necessarily, right? So we're talking about, getting a sense of meaning from that experience. And whereas flow state is sort of being lost in an experience, right? You forget yourself for a while. So those are different things, right?
And I would argue that if he truly had that experience, there would probably be several times during that, and I think that's what people would describe, is that several times during that day for significant stretches of time, I lost myself in that experience. I was just being part of my family. Now, the transitions between things, or while I'm on my phone or whatever, maybe those were times he was not in flow state, but I suspect that the experience of that beautiful day was being rapidly in and out of flow state and staying in flow state for long stretches of time.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I'm going to have to go back and read up on other people's definition
fair enough.
of flow state, because that's never not how I've always kind of understood it as not necessarily just purely cognitive, right? I mean, it could also be physical as well, but definitely like a directed activity of some kind, whether that's cognitive or physical, right? And it's not like spending the whole day with family. That's not a directed activity. It's a very expansive. You could be doing a million things in that one day, right? Whereas rock climbing, again, I know you think that the examples of rock climbing or writing an essay or whatever the example might be, that limits the idea, but that's just not how I've.
So let me maybe bridge the gap. There is that I guess what I was saying is that during the course of that day, he would be doing specific things at various times. So he could lose himself in barbecuing a steak, right? And then he could lose himself in, in the moment of just enjoying watching the dog play, right? And then he could lose. So in between, he may not be in flow state. But those are mini directed activities. Those are, right? And so the day would be formed as an experience of being in flow state a bunch of times, not continuously. But
I think most people just refer to that as being in the moment, right? And
I don't think there's much different.
Yeah,
I don't think there's much difference.
I kind of do. I mean, in the sense that, like I said, the flow state, as I've understood it. Now we're basically just arguing definitions. Like what?
No, but it is an important.
What do people mean?
Yeah.
What do people mean when they say flow state? Right? I've had a very specific understanding of what that meant, and that's why it was significant when he brought it up, because what you're describing is just a sense of meaning. I mean, you're basically almost like equating the two. You might as well replace one for the other. And then this whole conversation could be awakening from the flow state or awakening into the flow state, right? Might as well.
Well, but again, as I said, I think you experience it as meaningful afterward. That's kind of the interesting thing, right? Is you and he does say the more time you spend in flow state, the more you find your life meaningful.
Sure,
right?
Yeah.
So he himself made that connection.
But I don't know that one equals the other, which is almost kind of where you're getting at, is that, well, they're pretty much synonymous terms. A sense of meaning and being in the flow state.
Well, once again, I think, I'm saying that, again, very similar to the previous point, I think your misunderstanding is I'm trying to say that of all the times I would say that being in flow is a necessary but not necessarily sufficient condition for meaningfulness, right? Or experiencing meaningfulness after the fact. Similar to what I was saying about the shamanistic insight cascade ritual being a necessary but not sufficient condition for development of psychotechnology, right? So there is a relationship there, but it's not one-to-one. It's one is a superset of the other.
Right. Okay. I think we kind of talked out our definitions of flow state. I think at the end of the day, it just sort of comes down to a difference in our understanding of what the word means, right? And your definition is much more expansive than my definition. and then we could spend forever discussing whose definition is
No, I agree.
more.
I agree that there's just that difference there. I think maybe the reason it was interesting to go down that road, and we can use that as a springboard to the next topic, is certainly he does say, and I think the literature supports, that if you are not experiencing flow state, there are certain things that tend to precipitate it, that have a higher probability of pushing you into flow state. Okay. Yeah. Right. And those are the things. So that's where we may agree more, right? Is if you are not experiencing your life as meaningful in some way, right? The question is, what could you do about that? And I think that in order to do something about that, you need to start setting up conditions in which you are pushed into a flow state on topics that matter to you.
Yeah, I totally agree with. Yeah.
And so for people who, and maybe that's the reason I was arguing a bit, is that people who find their family meaningful need to make time to have an opportunity to be wholly absorbed in that experience, right?
And in fact,
so,
just to continue to agree with you, I mean, one of the things that I wanted to ask you about, because I didn't know we would be talking about like the definition of flow state. I thought we were on the same page there. But one of the things he brings up is you could get into a flow state playing video games. Which maybe I'm biased or something, but I don't know that video games are necessarily meaning-making activities. I don't know that you could play a video game and then walk away thinking, well, that was a meaningful experience. I don't play video games very much, but my limited video game playing did not result in that experience at all. So one of the questions is that, well, if you can be engaged in an activity that induces a flow state, that doesn't necessarily lead to meaning in all sort of flow state-like activities, right? Which kind of like goes, not to drag out the definition of flow state again, but if you get into flow states and that doesn't result in meaning, then that changes.
Like I said, it's a superset. It's the number of meaningful flow states is a subset of all the possible flow states.
Yeah.
It's possible to get into flow, again, on something that doesn't matter in the right way. It's not oriented to your, and you and I have talked about this different times. There's something about meaningfulness in terms of how you fit with the universe or how you fit with the external world, right? There's a sense of fitting rightly in the experience of meaningfulness. And that's why, again, I keep pushing back on the idea that it can be free of context, that you can really experience that truly in isolation. Because no, deep in the idea of meaning is that I am fitting rightly with the universe, and the human universe is social to its core. So that's why I think video games are often kind of a false flag, is that they enter you into the flow state, but they are sufficiently divorced from reality that they can never really provide what they seem they're always about to provide, right? Is they're about to provide meaning and then somehow they don't. With the exception, perhaps, of games that have some social element. So people who make friends in real life because they met in a world or in a game, right? So, again, if there is some connection to the real world in the interactivity of humans, then maybe you do begin fitting rightly there. I think there are couples who enjoy gaming together, and that's something that's bonding between them, right? So then that flow state can be hugely meaningful in those contexts, but it's context dependent. It's social dependence.
Yeah.
Right.
So that sort of like highlighted to me the idea that you should carefully choose the flow state to engage in, right? And the best kind of flow states might be engaging in activities that further your sort of purpose, the things that matter to you, right? And so that the flow state is a tool that gets you to an end, and it's not necessarily just the end itself. Right, because you could get, you could have bad flow states as well, which is why I was kind of pushing back at like flow states.
Maybe I oversee. Yeah.
Oh, no, so now you're admitting you're wrong. Well, let's time mark this. No, so I mean,
I think that's a good. I think that's a good counterpoint. Yeah, I think I have to, because I had previously said that maybe flow state was its own sense, its own reward, right?
Yeah.
And in that statement, there's I think meaning is its own reward. But in that statement, I think I conflated flow state and meaningfulness too much. Mm-hmm. And I think they're not maybe that exactly mapped onto each other. You're right. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So coming back to my earlier point that I think the larger significance of him talking about the flow state is that it allowed humans to be able to like make connections, right? So if you're a video game player, you are getting better at the video game if you're just in a flow state, right? I mean, the more hours you practice, suddenly you break a level, you get a skill, and that skill comes about because you have learned patterns of how to manipulate the game in a way that achieves your ends, right? So you have acquired skill, and the acquirement of skill requires the formation of connections in your brain and the connections of abstractions as well. So for me, my understanding of his whole description of flow state was that it was a salience inducing mechanism. And not to get too science fiction-y about it, but one of the crazy thoughts I had was, well, if we live in a simulation, then perhaps all we are human, our human cognition is basically a meaning-making cognitive substrate. It's like, okay, we need these minions to tell us what connections are real here. Again, I'm just partially joking over here, right? But if you were to think of like the mind, that the biggest role of the mind is to create salient connections, then the highest form of that art is when you enter flow states, is when you are able to make connections in profound ways, in unexpected ways. I mean, we make connections all the time. You can do that by type 2 thinking, but the flow state sort of incorporates type 1 and type 2, and then it alters your consciousness, and then the combination of that results in connection. And by connection here, I'm talking about if you're connecting disparate data points together, you're essentially getting to the truth of the matter, and the truth of the matter is something that is profoundly, inherently important to us, right? So if flow states gets in as much as flow states get us closer to truth seeking or salience, finding.
How are you using the term salience?
Salient in the sense that the connection between these two things are not only real, but they matter to me.
So I guess that's kind of
there. He talks a lot about salience is a word he uses quite a bit going forward. You'll find so,
and I understand it, but I think that in that regard, I might again I think that I agree that flow state is helpful in finding quote unquote true connections, right? So, well, useful connections, and that's an interesting.
Yeah, truth is tricky. Right? What is
truth is tricky. Truth is tricky.
Truth to you. Right.
Sure. But I think truth to you often means useful. Like again, going back to your video game example, right? What is true about the patterns you develop, right? Well, they're true within the context of they're useful within the context of the game.
That's perhaps where salient is a better word, right? Connections.
I would find that less. Or a less accurate word. To me, salient implies... So salient can mean significant in the sense of remarkable, but can also mean significant in the sense of meaningful. Mm-hmm. And I think we're talking about how flow state cannot be meaningful, right? You can have flow states that are not necessarily provoking of meaning because they're not fitted with the universe significant.
Meaning here,
correctly.
Meaning here, fidelity, truthfulness, in as much as it gets you to the next point. So if you're playing a video game and you just have a really difficult time trying to kill this monster because you just can't maneuver your character in just the right way, and after you try 50 times, you finally figure out the right pattern of attack, right? And you slay the beast, right? So truthfulness and meaning is that, okay, I have discovered the pattern required to be able to slay this virtual monster in this machine. So in salient in that way, it's true in that way. Now, it may not render a life of meaning and purpose, but we're not talking about that right now. We're just talking about finding the correct pattern to get to the quote-unquote the next level.
Yes, finding the correct pattern, I think we can agree on that language for sure.
Yeah.
Which I may jump there for a moment, if you will. He used a phrase that actually I quite liked, is ready for exaptation, right? And exaptation, it bothers me a little that he's using that term, only because repurposing is a much easier term. And it means the exact same thing, but cognitive repurposing, I think, would communicate more clearly without needing to introduce repurposing.
Yeah, that's.
I don't think you would need the new fancy word. I think they're basically synonyms. But anyway, regardless, he used the phrase "ready for exaptation," and I quite liked that. right? And it reminds me a bit of video
You know,
games
you
in
should
that
put that on a a T-shirt and just walk around
I should.
town.
I should. Yeah, I think that phrase captivated me a bit because, so the video game example, there have been companies and there have been studies that people who achieved a certain level as troop leaders in like World of Warcraft were actually fantastic managers. Like they did great at middle management in companies, right? Because the ability to bring people together, organize people, direct them to a common goal, that set of patterns became actually ready for exaptation, right? Ready to be repurposed to a new goal. And there were companies who would recruit actually within the game to try to get people to be managers at this company because they found. Similarly, for instance, people who are good at video games have an easier time, surgeons who are good at video games have an easier time with laparoscopic surgery. Yeah, so that is also a known effect, is that set of techniques is ready for repurposing, right? You've built these skills and you found these quote-unquote true patterns, and now you have something that translates over to the real world, right, where it does matter. So these things can be more tricky. It's hard to write off any particular thing because you never know when that pattern that seems divorced from reality may suddenly be ready to be repurposed in a very real-world kind of way, right?
That's a good point. Yeah, I mean, I guess if you're playing video games to distract yourself from how miserable your life is, and I think that's the motif we have in our heads. At least I have in my. I'm very anti-video game in general. But as soon as I hear, oh, this guy is a gamer, he plays 8 hours a day, I'm like, okay, this guy lives in his mom's basement. But that's obviously not the truth. I think Elon Musk plays video games every now and then. But yeah, if you were playing video games and you're entering the quote unquote flow state in order to forget your life, then perhaps that's maladaptive use of the flow state. But if you're doing it because you want to be a better surgeon, well, by all means, then it's interesting that then in that case the purpose of the activity, the context changes for you. And then when you get up, like after playing Mind of Warcraft, yes, training for middle management, like another day in.
Sure.
And then suddenly the activity attains another meaning, only partially being facetious here.
Well, I mean, I think it is an interesting question, this notion of using or misusing something like the flow state, right? Which is insight generating, right? But he talks about this as like, how do you set up an environment so that you get correct intuitions rather than false intuitions, right? Miscalibrating your intuition system if your environment is such that it makes connections that are not correct, right? And you think of people that have been raised in traumatic homes and they learn intuitive lessons that are not correct because that within that context that did seem to be the pattern, right? And it's only when the context changes. So similarly, if you learn certain things, depending on your management style, maybe within World of Warcraft, right? Depending on what lesson you learn about how to manage people, it may be ready to be repurposed or it may not, depending on what patterns you find. And similarly, if you're using it just to escape, then that may be a poor use of that flow-inducing mechanism.
Do you have any other thoughts on the exaptation or not?
No, I mean, I do think I think that it's interesting because that exaptation is in itself basically the creation of metaphor. It's basically saying, hey, your brain makes a disparate connection. It's an example of that, right? It's like, oh, hey, we know how to do this, and this set of patterns can be applied fairly immediately to this other thing, and then you go ahead, right?
Yeah. So just going back to what I said some time ago that you sort of summarily agreed with, which was the correct question to ask is not what is the meaning of life, but how can I organize my life and how can I act so that my life is imbued with meaning, and that meaning of life is an action and it's not a philosophy, right? That actually was something when I listened to this lecture, one of the more profound realizations for me. And then I'm coming at this from, and you may be puzzled at like, well, that's like really obvious, like, of course.
No, it's not. No, it's not.
Okay.
It's no, I don't think it's obvious at all within our modern cultural context. I think, frankly, I think this is why I hold martial arts in such high regard. Is I was fortunate enough to really get into karate when I was in high school, super into it and whatever, and sparring, and I mean, the experience of being punched in the face, there isn't an explanation, right? it's a different experience.
It will definitely put
right?
you in altered states of consciousness for sure. Getting punched
yeah,
in the face.
and certainly talking about flow, right? Is if you're sparring and if you fail, you get punched in the face. Well, failure matters, right? Now you're wearing yeah, exactly. I mean, thankfully I didn't have taxes in high school, but yeah, I think that experience primed me for the belief that you cannot think your way to meaningfulness. You can act your way to meaningfulness. That feelings follow actions, not the other way around. That's something that I've struggled with. I actually think that's a tremendous source of anxiety for people if they think that their actions should flow from their feelings.
Yeah. Or their thinking, not even...
Or their thinking even.
Yeah. Is that they feel like this is the road to meaning and purpose, right? And that could be a career plan, it could be a life plan, and if they're not following the life plan, then they get miserable. So
I think even worse is what do you do if I don't feel like something's meaningful? Like I don't feel like I'm depressed and I don't feel like anything's meaningful, right? Well, I think that misunderstanding is why depression is so hard to escape, is we don't tell people that you have to behave your way out of depression. Mm-hmm. You can't talk, therapy and all the, you can't talk your way out. You can't think your way out. You have to act your way out.
Yeah.
Right. And I will say, I think that's actually one of the other interesting, he mentions this briefly, but I've been thinking about this. I love the movie Good Will Hunting, for instance. But in a variety of movies, for quite some time, therapists are presented as shamans. That's the I would say that is the language of what the therapists have come to inhabit the archetype of the shaman in our modern sensibilities. Except my actual personal experiences in therapy, these are idiots who have no idea what they're doing and just, that sounds difficult, right? And there's no insight to be gained, right? Because that person is not a shaman. They actually don't have the ability to generate insights and enter flow state and actually do the things that we associate from movies or whatever that we need. We need a shaman, right? When we are suffering, when we are having a hard time, we need a shaman to come and tell us, hey, these are the things these are the actions you should take that will walk you out of the place you're in. But that person, we've close again through this nihilistic smoldering nihilism or whatever, we've kind of closed the entry to creating those people, and they're hard to find now. I think priests used to be, or imam, like there were these ideas that you could go somewhere and find a shaman, right? But we've closed all those doors in so many ways, in different ways. Through excessive orthodoxy, right, in the religious spheres, to excessive scientism. I would call it's actually very difficult when you're having a hard time to go find a shaman who will say, "Hey, let me talk to you, and as I listen, I'll enter a flow state because I'm that good, and I will gain an intuitive knowing of what I should say that will help you walk your way out." Right? Maybe martial arts is the only place where that's even partially still present.
I would stay for a moment with this idea of
or weightlift, actually, or weightlifting, CrossFit, those kinds of things. I think again, those are also action oriented, and I think that's why people get such benefit out of doing them.
Yeah.
Anyway, sorry,
I would stay for a moment on the idea that meaning is found in action and not abstraction, right? And why I found that particular, even though this is not the point he was making, I got to that idea from, oh, well, flow states can induce senses of meaning or give you a sense of meaning. Therefore, meaning is a sense. So again, a word that we don't have a good, a sense that we don't have a good word for in English. And the reason that was profound to me, again, we talked about sort of my history of how I came into this, and that for like about 10 years or so, I was a scientism-minded parasist. Sure. I'm like, well, show me the evidence, right? Everything has to be type 2. Everything has to come from type 2 thinking, right? Give me the philosophy for why I should believe this, that, or the other, or do anything at all. And that's something that science sort of promoted for great good. I mean, a lot of useful things have occurred from that way of thinking, but the error that we, I think, made as sort of just a collective scientism-based or influenced society is that we feel like all answers must come from there. Yep. That unless there is a philosophy that you could write down on a piece of paper, unless you can come up with a paper, right, a theorem that would then infer this is how you get to meaning. If that cannot be written down, then it's not worth talking about or engaging in, right? And that's a very empirical mindset.
And that I agree, and that is the mythology of our modern culture that is in some way poisoning our culture. And the irony of the whole thing, as I have told you, as we've talked about it at different times, is there is a theorem, Gödel's theorem, that actually tells you that doesn't work, right? We have mathematically proved that even within mathematics, the set of things that is true is greater than the set of things that can be proven. Mm-hmm. And there are non-trivial statements that can be made that cannot be proven, right? And so that's an odd thing, right? The idea that we already know that type 2 thinking cannot lead to the entire set of truths. And we've actually proven that mathematically. Right. That's an odd thing, right? And then if you take that a step further, if you talk about chaos theory and predictability and those kinds of things, right? Stephen Wolfram and his commentary on the idea that very simple rules can lead to nearly infinite complexity in a way that cannot be predicted from the outset. You can only understand that if you run the loop a million times and realize, oh wow, this became really complex, right? The game of life type thing, right? But so we know these things scientifically. Science has led us to its own limits, and yet it goes against our cultural norm, and so we assume that can't be true, right? That we just need more computing power. We just need, and we refuse to acknowledge the fact this appears to be baked into the substrate of reality, that there are things that are true that cannot be proven by type 2 thinking. You can only leap there intuitively.
To use a clumsy analogy, we are still stuck in the Newtonian physics world, and we need to drag our ideologies into the Einsteinian
into the quantum world, at the very least, right?
Where we don't actually know for anything for sure, or we can't have the complete picture for sure, right? Sure. So anyway, that's just a clumsy analogy, but I thought that was fun.
No, I think even in quantum mechanics, I find it fascinating, right? Is that people talk about collapsing the waveform, but refuse to give a definition of observation. And whatever the definition of observation is, it's bizarre. You have to admit that is a bizarre phenomenon, right? It's absurdly weird. Yeah.
It's weird. There's another thing I wanted to talk about, which it was just sort of a quirky thing that I came up with when I was listening to the implications of literacy as a psychotechnology, and moving away from the idea of flow states. Alphabetic literacy was invented, and then as a result of that, more people were able to read and write. And one of the ways that I thought about why that was such a profound thing, so he says it was profound because it then allowed us, because we could actually think in literate terms, we could think in concrete words that had an image in our heads, the ability to abstract and then use that abstraction for self-reflection and an examination of our metacognition, that like jumped up a step function as a result of alphabetic literacy and the ability to think in far more complicated abstract ways, right? And we talked about IQ tests going up the last podcast, and just part of that is just because we're getting better and better at handling abstractions as a species, right? And so alphabetic literacy was the first sort of not quantum leap, but it was a big giant leap forward in the ability to think in in ever abstract ways. And one of the fun ways that I thought about how that might work, or why that's also profound, is that if we think that humans, it's not humans that have ideas, but ideas that have humans, then perhaps the alphabetic literacy increased the computing substrate in which ideas can live amongst humanity, right? So if now there's 10,000 people who can hold a certain complicated idea in their head, well, now you get 10,000 souls that are able to contribute to the idea even further. And so our speed of abstraction complexity started going up quite a bit because now the substrate was much larger as well. Now, this has nothing to do with meaning or purpose, but I kind of thought that was an interesting way as well as thinking about it, is that it sort of turbocharges the speed at which abstractions happen. And if you think about before alphabetic, when everyone is illiterate, how slow it must have been for complexities to emerge, complex abstractions to emerge. It must have been
and so
this goes...
Yeah, but this goes exactly all the way back to where we kind of started, right? To the connection, the metaphor that my mind drew was that shamanism, that method of entering flow state and getting insight from there in an intuitive, implicit way, was the artistic version. The industrial version is alphabetic literacy. Is you gain the ability to gain insights on reflection, right? So that it, and here's the interesting thing, is that an artist always retains a bit of an aspect that is not transmitted to the corresponding industry, right? So in my example of forceps, is C-section doesn't have the same recovery rate. It's not as good, right? But, so the industrialized version always takes a step down in quality in some sense, right? But it allows something similar, which is, in the case of C-section, safe delivery, like at least minimizing loss of life, right? Both mom and child. And gains spreadability. It gains repeatability. So that the alphabetic literacy spreadability, because it was so easily learned, allowed more people, as you said, to be computing on these problems. Now, they may not have been computing at the same level as someone entering flow state and gaining really disparate insights, right? But there was some computing that was happening on these ideas, right? So that industrialization of the insight process, which previously I think had been relegated to the artistic model of ritualistically entering the flow state, right? In order to gain deeper insights. Now you lose something in quality, but you gain it in learnability.
Well, yes and no. I think that is true in as much as you are using the psychotechnology of literacy to dive deeply and think deeply about complicated abstractions. You're not entering any kind of flow state when you're reading the menu at Torchy's Tacos, right?
Oh, I am.
But
at Torchy's, you better believe I'm entering a flow state. Sorry. Go ahead.
But you know what I mean, right? As opposed to you are using the tool of literacy and alphabetic literacy to think very deeply about some medical idea, then you can enter a flow state because you're thinking so deeply and you're holding some very complicated...
No, you're misunderstanding. I would say that... Let me take a step back. I would say that alphabetic literacy is the industrialized version of entering flow state, right? Where you are able...
It can be.
No, you're still not understanding. You're not entering flow state just from alphabetic literacy.
Okay.
That's not flow state. It's the industrialized, crappy version of flow state. Meaning that it gives you the opportunity to gain insight, not the level of complexity. You lose the degree of complex insight that you can gain. I'm not communicating.
No, but
you're hung up on the.
I understand I feel your like point, but you can get to flow state using tools of the as well. So I think you're conflating the tool for the proposed or potential effect it can have. For example, if you're trying to desperately solve some difficult math equation or prove a theorem. You could be at it for hours and hours. You're engaged in a very high complex abstraction that involves, numeracy, literacy in order to effect that. And that activity could get you into a flow state. But the same tools are also used to read a menu in a restaurant, right? So it's the same technology. You're using it in one way to enter a flow state because you're engaged in a complicated abstraction, and in another sense, it's
let me give you a different example. If you are journaling about something and you're writing about some experience that you've had, right? And then later on you go back and you read that journal and you say, he talks about sort of realizing your capacity for self-deception, right? And you say, oh, actually, no, I got that wrong. That's not actually what was going on, right? In my journal, I wrote that I think my spouse is cheating on me and all this, whatever. And then you read it again a month later, 2 months later, and you go, oh, no, I was actually wrong. That I interpreted the information incorrectly, and I need to learn better how to interpret these clues, right? Or the signals that I get from my partner, because they did not mean what I thought they meant. That writing has allowed you to communicate better with your past self, right? And gain an insight. At no time in any of these proposals were you in a flow state, in my hypothetical example.
Yeah.
But you gained an insight that would have required flow state to gain before the advent of writing.
Gotcha. Right.
And that's what I mean by the industrialized version.
But why do you say
facilitate something similar?
Are you implying that version is lesser than?
Yes.
Oh, it is? Why do you say that? I mean, I would think that you're actually leveraging tools to increase self-knowledge and insight.
So it becomes self-referential. So
if you can compare your state of minds that are separated in time from one year to the next, it's a very powerful tool that perhaps a shamanistic ritual might not be able to access, because you're compressing time, right, in a way that only alphabetic literacy has allowed you to be able to do, whereas you may not be able to do that at all in a shamanistic ritual. So in some sense, there is advantages to, or there's ways to get deeper insight because the psychotechnology is allowing you to think in a different manner. And again, you're also connecting the flow state idea with psychotechnologies again, and we've already been down that road.
Yeah, we won't have to retake that territory. I think what I'm trying to say is, I think that without flow state, the degree of complexity of insight that can be gained from alphabetic literacy is less than, it is of a lesser level of complexity.
So
I think that if you
writing,
combine them, I think if you combine them, then you get an exponential jump. So people who are
So if Kant had done shamanistic rituals when he was writing the critique of,
I'm pretty sure
reason.
he did.
No, but that's
reasonably
sure. That is my
sure.
counter example, right? So some of the most profound insights, connections between very complex abstractions, not self-knowledge, right? When Newton,
you don't think he was in? I feel very confident he was in a flow state.
100%, but he was not doing any ritualistic. He was just sitting down with a pen and paper using.
You don't think that's a ritual? Sitting down with pen and paper is a phenomenal ritual.
But, it is. But he's using literacy to do it, right?
And that's what I'm saying is that you can combine literacy with the flow state and exponentially jump the complexity beyond either one. But if you're just comparing literacy without flow state with flow state without literacy, I think the flow state offers you a higher level of complexity of connections that can be made.
Sure.
Right?
Yeah, I mean,
now,
if you want to...
Now you start combining them, then you get a synergistic effect. But there is something about the idea of, with literacy, even without flow state, you can start to have insights. You can start to make connections even without flow state. And I'd argue that was actually relatively difficult pre-literacy. If you're not literate and you're not entering a flow state, I think you're very concrete in the world. I don't think you're having a bunch of connections of disparate things, right? So I think one of the interesting things about alphabetic literacy is that it facilitates insight generation even at times that you're not in flow. And then if you add on being in flow plus alphabetic literacy, now you're cooking with gas.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, sure, if you're going to think about, well, the act of writing is a ritual, that almost seems like a sneaky trick. Like, well, that's where the ritual comes in, and therefore that ritual results in a flow state.
But every self-help guru under the sun talks about this, right? Is that like...
About what? Writing?
Well, about the idea of developing... I mean, what is a habit but a ritual, right? They're very closely linked, right? Sure. Is that, well, I go and I have a set place where you write, because when you sit down, your mind will start to enter the right framework as you repeat that over time, right? I think that's exactly a description of how to enter flow.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I agree. I don't disagree. I'm not sure that was like a...
Well, now I'm not comfortable. Now I want to disagree with you, but I'm not comfortable with your agreement.
Yeah, no, I mean, sure, if making a cup of coffee and sharpening your pencils, if that's considered part of the ritual, that's fine. I don't have an objection to that statement.
Well, I mean, it's just that the reason I mentioned that is I think that rituals are psychotechnologies. And I talked about this idea of many psychotechnologies that come out of flow states or whatever. But I think things like atomic habits, and I think what these guys are pointing at is rituals or psychotechnologies, and you can develop psychotechnologies that help you enter flow. And so you're now leveraging self-created psychotechnologies, and then of course people want to share them. Right? Is that, well, I do it this way and this is what works for me or whatever. But yeah, I think that's why rituals are so powerful, is because they are psychotechnologies. Is they're like, hey, if you want to induce sleep, right? Well, do these things in this order consistently over time. Develop a ritual of winding down for sleep, and you will find sleep easier. You will find it easier to fall asleep, right? So it's an interesting thing is that you compare a psychotechnology like alphabetic literacy, right, or numeracy, he talks about that, right, which are sort of widespread, huge, shared psychotechnologies with like your ritual of how to fall asleep, right, which is a very personal psychotechnology, right? It's sort of just for me. Like, I might share it with other people if I find it useful, but it's not inherently something that's sort of a worldwide phenomenon. But I think that psychotechnology, I think he talks about the big psychotechnologies, and I think I'm kind of interested in the mini personal psychotechnologies that can help people engage in, and this gets back to our discussion of acting your way out of a mental state, is these rituals allow you to facilitate change, to facilitate movement. And as a physician in particular, I'm very intrigued by the idea of individualized mini psychotechnologies that enhance your experience of meaningfulness or enhance your participation in a meaningful existence.
Yeah, and then again, like there's a definitional problem, or like when you say psychotechnologies, are you actually talking about rituals? Where does one begin and the other end?
I would claim that rituals are a type of psychotechnology. According to his definition, right? His definition was a standardized method of cognitive enhancement.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, no, sure. I mean, my understanding of it was like much more broad, right? Like large things, like the literacy, numeracy. I would probably put AI to some extent on that list as well, these days.
Sure. But he offered a definition. I guess that's my point, is that like, and according to that definition, even these little rituals, having a cup of coffee in the morning, they all fit and are important cognitive enhancements. Right? Is that people often report, well, if I don't have my cup of coffee, I feel off or whatever. And imagine, I mean, for me, it would be an awful thing if somebody said, well, you have to substitute your cup of coffee every morning for a caffeine tablet of equivalent dose. Right? it would not serve the same purpose. I would not have that same experience.
Yeah, fair enough. Fair enough. All right. Are there any other points over here that we wanted to go over?
Mostly that you're wrong, and that if we can find some other place where we can clearly show how wrong you are, that would be ideal.
I'm sure
I think
there'll be lots of opportunities for you to quote unquote prove me wrong. There's no wrong here. I mean, obviously we're just kidding, but this is one of the reasons that I wanted to do this with you is we obviously listen to the same thing, and to not surprised at all, we get
somewhat different
takes on it. Not like incredibly different to the point that like we can't converge on anything, but different enough to make the conversation interesting, and then to also sort of double down on my own understanding of like what is the lecture really about. So I find value in us disagreeing all the time.
No, totally. I think that's the huge value is when we have, and I don't know for sure that my very broad definition of flow is correct. That was my intuition, and I kind of defended it in terms of like our argumentation, but it'll be interesting to read up a little more on what exactly does that work. Like, can you actually broaden it that way, or is it more in line with what we've kind of described? I did want to this will come up in lecture 3 more, I think, because it was right at the end of the lecture, and I think he's going to pick up this thread. But he talks about at the end of the axial revolution, this alphabetic literacy combining with numeracy and the need for logical or mathematical thinking, right? So on the one hand, you have alphabetic literacy that expands your capacity for insight, your capacity to link ideas together over time with yourself, with other people, right? And then the development of some sort of logic, right? Which is the prototype maybe is coins, is exchanging numeric value rather than an emotional or intuitive sense of value. Is that like, well, how much is my goat worth to me? Mm-hmm. Well, if you put a number on it, all of a sudden you're forcing a certain clarity rather than an intuitive sense of how valuable the goat is, right? Yeah. And how much value you would need in return in order to be willing to give the goat. Like, is it worth 1 sheep or 2 sheep? And that's all done intuitively before the development of very numeric means of exchange. And I think that combination, then, he talks about it making you aware of your ability for self-deception, the ability to really logically, rigorously analyze your thoughts and say, no, I am thinking incorrectly, or my intuition was wrong, right? And I think also that's another one we lost, is that I think we've gotten to this point, well, your feelings are all valid, right? All emotions are... No, actually... feelings are not all valid. Many feelings are based on false premises, false information, or not shared beliefs, or whatever it is, and we need to be able to invalidate those. That's a tremendous amount of the point here, is that even if you get a very strong feeling, a very strong intuition, merely the strength of it is not the final determinant of its truth, right? And he said something that he said that led to a sense of greater personal responsibility because you were able to draw the connections between your self-deception and the negative outcomes after the fact, right? But also led to the idea that a disciplined mind would lead to the development of wisdom. And I thought that was a brilliant idea, that what is a disciplined mind? It is one that has the capacity for abstract thinking in linking disparate ideas, new intuitions, new innovations, combined with this logical side that is able to compute on when those are deceiving you. When is that intuition just a self-deception, right? Exactly. And that combination is sort of the beginnings of wisdom. That I'm really excited to hear him kind of like flesh that out in lecture 3.
Yeah, I think that's well said. You have to remember how much your goat is worth, because you're going to have to buy 2 camels for it, and there has to be a very specific price that's agreed upon. You have to keep track of all those things. If you don't, you're going bankrupt. Everyone takes all your goats, and your society collapses. So coinage and basically the invention of money was somewhat an unforgiving logic was imposed on society that transferred to the individual. Like, listen, I need to pay attention here to how much I'm getting for my goats, because last time I got this much and this time I'm getting this much, and if I sell them for any less than that much, then my family is going to go hungry. And so you are forced to think about caring for your future in these very abstract, weird terms, like, well, this much amount of coinage is how much I need to get through to the winter, right? And once you start thinking in those terms, the capacity for self-deception is a little bit lessened. Of course, not dramatically, but there's an important psychotechnology, if you want to call coinage a psychotechnology, or at least it can act as
the
one,
concept of money, at least. Right.
Yeah, the concept of money. Yeah, that's a great point. The concept of money is a psychotechnology, that it imposes an order on society that filters down to the individual self and makes them a bit more resistant, not immune to, but more resistant to self-deception. I think that's a good point.
Well, and I think that is the trend, is that you need intuition for insight and connect and innovation and connecting different ideas, but you also need some... It's very easy to, because it's implicit learning, not explicit learning, right? It's things you know, but you don't know why you know. Like how far away to stand from someone when you first meet them versus a good friend. Like he gives that example, and it's a great one because it's like, well, I don't know how I know that. I just know from various bits of feedback over time, right? But what if you coded that wrong? What if you learned the wrong distances somehow, or you enter a new culture that has different perceptions of distance, right? Well, you have to be able to bring that into the explicit realm and recode, right? You have to sort of impose an external logic, at least onto the failure, right? Like at least you have to say, well, I'm recognizing that I am failing in this new circumstance. And that, where I'm going with that is, I think a lot of people in a practical sense struggle when they refuse to impose clarity on their intuitions, meaning the intuition just stays vague, right? Like I vaguely think this, or be nice to people, and that their entire morality or value system is, well, kind of try to be nice to people, right? Well, obviously, if you're being murdered, you probably shouldn't like emphasize being nice to your murderer as he's stabbing you, right? Like there are obvious counterexamples, but forcing that logical clarity that pulls people into nuance, I think can be incredibly protective of your psyche on an individual level, and that is something like the development of wisdom, right?
Yeah. He gets into that later on when he starts talking about bullshit.
Oh yeah.
It was his
the Frankfurt book. Yeah.
Capacity for self-deception. So excited to talk about that later. All right, man. Any
Cool.
other points?
No,
I think we
that's...
picked this lecture apart here. We kind of covered everything that he went over, I believe.
Yep.
Any other points?
I think that's right.
Raise?
Nope.
That's
all I got.
All right, man. See you for the next
All right.
one then.
Yeah. Cool. See ya.
Bye, dude.